All right, good morning, everybody. This is the IRTF Open meeting. My name is Colin Perkins. I'm the IRTF chair. I'd like to start with a reminder of the Note Well requirements for this meeting and the intellectual property requirements. This is an IRTF meeting. The IRTF follows the IETF's intellectual property rights disclosure rules. And as a result, when you're participating in this meeting, you must disclose, a reminder that you must disclose any patents or patent applications that are owned or controlled by yourself or your sponsor. In the IRTF, we expect such disclosures to be filed in a timely manner, a period of days or weeks rather than months. And that the slide has the references to the full details of this policy. In addition, a reminder that we make recordings of these meetings available. The meeting is being streamed live, going out on YouTube, and the recording will also be available on YouTube after the meeting. If you are participating in person and are not wearing one of the red do not photograph lanyards, then you're consenting to appear in these recordings. And if you're standing up on stage and giving one of the presentations, obviously you'll be recorded. Similarly, if you're participating online and you turn on your camera or your microphone, you're giving consent to appear in the recordings. As I say, this meeting is being recorded and being live streamed. A reminder that any personal information you provide will be handled in accordance with the privacy policy, and also a very important reminder of the code of conduct and the anti-harassment procedures. A reminder that you agree to work respectfully with the other participants. If you have any issues with that, please talk to myself or contact the Ombuds team, whether it's in this meeting or with the IETF or the IRTF in general. If you are here in the room, please do scan the QR code on the screen and sign in using the Meet Echo Light tool, and that will record your attendance and allow us to size the rooms appropriately in future. If you're attending remotely, please make sure your audio and your video are off unless you're explicitly asking a question. If you have any problems with the technology, there's a URL on the website, or send email to support@ietf.org. Final reminder, as a COVID safety measure, the in-person participants in this meeting and in the other IETF controlled rooms are required to wear FFP2 N95 masks, with the exception of the chairs of the meeting and the presenters who are standing at the front and actively speaking. I think for this meeting, it is also permitted to remove your mask briefly while asking questions from the microphones. But for everyone in the audience, you are required to wear your mask at all times. All right, so the goals of the IRTF, and this is an IRTF session rather than an IETF session. The goals of the IRTF are to focus on some of the longer term research issues. We're here to think about where things might be going, to discuss some of the bigger picture issues, the longer term issues, perhaps as a way of feeding into the standards process that the IETF is doing, perhaps as a way of for the research community to learn from the standards process in the IETF and learn from the experience of the people in the IETF community. The IRTF is a research organization. We don't develop standards, and as a result, while we can publish informational and experimental RFCs, the primary research outputs from the primary outputs from the IRTF tend to be more in the form of research papers than in the form of RFCs. IRTF is organized as a number of research groups. The slide here, those in light blue or gray are either not meeting or have already met. The ones highlighted in dark blue here, the Path-Aware Networking Research Group, the Privacy Enhancements and Assessments Group, the Measurement and Analysis of Protocols Group, and the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Group are still to meet later this week, so please do consider going to their meetings. A little bit of research group news. I'd like to extend a welcome to Simone Ferlin and Michael Shapira, who have recently joined as co-chairs of the Internet Congestion Control Research Group, joining Jana Iyengar, who's been chairing that group for a number of years. So thank you very much to Jana for his service over many years, and I very much look forward to working with Simone and Michael, and thank them for their willingness to serve going forward. In addition, we have a couple of side meetings tomorrow, which are discussing work which might form potential new research groups. And you may have seen some email I sent to the attendees list and to the IETF discussion list. We've got a side meeting tomorrow lunchtime in the Richmond 6 room, and that room has changed from the initial announcement, which will be looking at usable formal methods. And there's been a number of people who've contacted me expressing interest in this. So I think we should have an interesting discussion about whether it makes sense to create a new research group in the space of formal methods and usability of formal methods for protocol specification in the IETF community. Another meeting which is happening at I think 3:30 tomorrow in Mezzanine 12 is a meeting to discuss a potential research group into researching the internet standards process. And Niels Tenöver is leading this effort. This follows on from a workshop the Internet Architecture Board organized, I think it was late last year, where a number of people were exploring the data we can extract from the data tracker and the mailing list archives, and trying to understand the process by which the IETF develops standards and understand the shifts in demographics and the shifts in the way the process works, to get some better understanding of who helps set standards and how effective the standard setting process is. So if you're interested in that topic, please go along to the meeting Niels is organizing tomorrow at 3:30. As I said earlier, the IRTF can produce RFCs. The last meeting cycle since the summer meeting in July has actually been one of our more productive cycles for producing RFCs, and I think this is the most RFCs I have to report in the 4 years I've been IRTF chair. And we've published 5 RFCs in the last cycle, a couple from the intent-based networking research group looking at intent classification and concepts and definitions for intent-based networking. A couple relating to information-centric networking, looking at integration of ICN protocols with 4G mobile networks, and looking at the integration with network coding protocols. And another protocol looking at network coding and forward error correction and its relation to congestion control in transport. So please do take a look at those RFCs. In addition to the research groups, we organize a couple of other activities in the IRTF. The main focus of today is the Applied Networking Research Prize. The Applied Networking Research Prize is something we organize in conjunction with the Internet Society and with sponsorship from Comcast and NBC Universal. And we give awards to celebrate some of the best recent results in applied networking, to celebrate interesting new ideas that might be coming out of the research community that might be relevant to the internet standards community, and to celebrate the achievements of upcoming people that we think might have a future impact on the standards community and the internet standards and technologies. I'm very pleased to announce that we will have, we'll be making 3 Applied Networking Research Prize awards today. These will go to Gautam Akiwate, who is sitting at the front here, who'll be talking about the risks of domain hijacking due to registrar practices, to Corinne Kath, who'll be talking about her ethnographic work on the IETF's culture, and to Daniel Wagner, who'll be talking about DDoS attack detection and mitigation. The papers for these are on the linked website, irtf.org/ANRP, and the talks will be happening in a minute, and will be the recordings will be available on YouTube afterwards. The ANRP is very much dependent on your nominations, and the nominations for the 2023 awards are open for another week or so. So if you have read any interesting applied networking research papers, if you know of any interesting work, any interesting people that you think would be prize-worthy, please do follow the link on the slide, nominate the papers, and self-nominations and third-party nominations are very much encouraged. And Meetecho appears to have stopped working. All right, sorry about that. In addition to the prizes, we are very pleased to offer a number of travel grants. We have a diversity travel grant program, and for the July meeting, we also have make travel grants available for the Applied Networking Research workshop. I'd very much like to thank the sponsors for the travel grant program, Akamai, Comcast, Cloudflare, and Netflix. I think this is a fantastic program. We've brought 3 or 4 really great people here this time, and we bring many more people for the Applied Networking Research Workshop in the summer. If you know of anyone from a perhaps underrepresented group, please do encourage them to apply for the awards. This is very much a program we're looking to expand. So if you work for a company which is willing to sponsor future awards, future travel grants, please do get in touch. And with that, I think that is all I have to say. The remainder of our agenda is the 3 Applied Networking Research Prize Awards for today. First up, we have Gautam, who'll be talking about risky business, followed by Corinne, and then Daniel to finish up. So thank you, everybody. Gautam. All right, you should have control. So the first talk today is given by Gautam Akiwate, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, for his paper on risky business, risks derived from registrar name management. This paper was originally published in the ACM Internet Measurement Conference in 2021. Gautam is a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University. He completed his PhD a few months ago from UC San Diego, where he was advised by Jeffrey Volker and Stefan Savage and Casey Claffey. He primarily works on the intersection of security and large-scale network measurement, and his recent work has looked at the security of DNS, TLS, and routing. And if you find this work interesting, I think you're talking in MapRG tomorrow, is it? Yes, yes. Where you'll be, it's something about the impact of the conflict on the Russian DNS, is that right?
Yeah, like it's basically us looking at the hosting DNS and TLS landscape after the February invasion. So it's called Where Are You? Cleverly enough. So.
Yep. Okay, so if you find this interesting, please also go on to MapRG tomorrow. And with that, I'll hand over to Gautam.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. My name is Gautam Akiwate, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University. And again, the only reason that it doesn't make it up on the slide is because I did this work when I was a PhD student at UC San Diego, advised by Stefan, Jeff, and Casey, who I'm told some of you know. So at a high level, this paper is a story of how well-meaning standards can encourage operational practices that lead to issues. And while I'm primarily going to talk about this risky business paper, I am also going to sort of, a lot of work has happened after the paper came out, and we've worked on some of the adjacent issues. So I'm going to sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about some of the follow-up work that we have done to sort of think about solutions more holistically. So this work essentially started as a result of 2 mysteries. The first mystery was a classic whodunit mystery. And the victim in this case was the White County, Georgia's official county domain, whitecounty.net. And what we saw was in July of 2019, one of the name servers, ns2.internetemc.com, was replaced with ns2.internetemc randomcharacters.biz. What was surprising about this domain was that internet EMC random characters.biz was not registered, which means that an attacker could go register this .biz domain and be the authoritative name server for a county domain. And the implications of that were troubling. So we started wondering, why did the name server change? Who changed the name server? And if this was accidental, was this a typo, or was this something more systemic? The second mystery that we saw was something we called drop this host anomaly. And in this, we saw that when we were looking at the zone files for 9 years worth of zone files, we found 33% of the name servers ending in .biz were of the form drop this host random characters.biz. And that was odd. So as an example, here's an example for yourgadgetnews.com. We saw its name servers, ns1 and ns2 nownnewbie.com, being replaced by drop this host string of random characters.biz. And again, we found ourselves asking, why did the name server change? Who changed the name servers? And in this case, given the large numbers, we realized it must be something systemic. Like, these can't be typos anymore. And in order to understand this better, in order to understand how these name servers get changed, we first needed to understand how these name servers get propagated. The DNS configuration gets propagated behind the scenes. And essentially, we were trying to understand how the DNS configuration flows from the registrant, which is the domain owner, who nominally operates the child zone, to the registry, which operates the parent zone. And we found that the registrar plays a central role in this propagation. So the registrant communicates any name server changes to the registrar using this web portal or an API. And the registrar, in turn, uses this protocol called Extensible Provisioning Protocol, EPP, to communicate these changes to the registry. And given that these were large numbers, and given that this was a systemic issue, we figured that there must be something amiss with EPP, and also the fact that we didn't understand anything about EPP. So what I'd like to do next, with apologies to all of the to Steve Hollenbach, who actually wrote the RFC on EPP, is to create a simplified mental model of what EPP is. And to sort of use that simplified mental model to sort of work through how EPP constraints can actually lead to this issue. And again, due apologies to the actual experts of RFC in the room. So a good place to start is to think of the registry top-level domain DNS configuration as a database. So all of the domain objects, the name servers, to think of them as a database. And this database has two sorts of objects. The first is a domain object, such as foo.com, and the second is a host object. And every host object that belongs to the same top-level domain, such as ns1.foo.com, needs to have a relationship with a domain object. In this case, ns1.foo.com is a subordinate host object of foo.com. And once you have that, you can then think of EPP as the specification on how this database can be modified. Okay, again, simplified mental model, due apologies. Okay, with that mental model, let's work through an example to see how we can get ourselves into problems. So consider two domain objects, one foo.com registered by registrar A, bar.com registered by registrar B. We next introduced the subordinate host objects, ns1 and ns2.foo.com for foo.com, which are subordinate host objects of foo.com, and ns1.bar.com, which is a subordinate host object of bar.com. We also show the delegated name server relationships, and each of these domains has two delegated name servers as is required. And what is the thing to keep in mind here is that bar.com has delegated its name service to a host object that is controlled by another registrar, and that in itself is not a problem. This happens all the time, designed for it, and everything works fine till foo.com expires. When foo.com expires, registrar A would like to sort of purge it from the database, if you will, in order to stop paying the registry for the domain. in order to do that, EPP requires that the registrar first clean up all of the associated host objects. So the registrar goes and cleans up ns1.foo.com without any problems. But as you can, some of you might have already anticipated, when the registrar tries to go and delete ns2.foo.com, it cannot do so because it is being referenced by another domain object and hence cannot be deleted. Now, this is a domain object that is controlled by another registrar. And so the registrar at this point of time has two options. One is not really an option because like it's to suck it up and just keep the domain as is in the registry database. But in this case, it means that it needs to continue paying for this domain, even though it has stopped getting paid for it. And so this is not really an option. And EPP sort of foresees this and presents a workaround, which is to rename the host object. So what does this renaming look like? What are some of the constraints around this renaming? And it turns out there are very little constraints. And like the primary constraint is that if the host object is renamed within the same top level domain, EPP requires that the domain object must exist. So as a concrete example, ns2.foo.com cannot be renamed to drop this host randomcharacters.com if drop this host randomcharacters.com does not exist. And given that EPP cannot check external references, like references to external top level domains, ns2.foo.com can totally be renamed to drop this host randomcharacters.biz because .biz is an external top level domain, even if drop this host, regardless of whether drop this host randomcharacters.biz exists or not. And these were the constraints, and we expected there to be a third, which was like just dropping the name server altogether. But having talked to registrars and registries, it seems like that is not really an option. So like you can't just drop the name server, like the host object altogether. So not entirely sure why. So given those constraints, the registrar now has two options. The first is to rename the name server to a sync domain. The sync domain is controlled by registrar A. This sort of guarantees that the domain object always exists so that the operation never fails. But now the registrar is on the hook for the queries and upkeep of the sync domain. And this is actually a problem because we at least know of multiple instances where registrars abandoned their sync domains, exposing thousands of domains to hijacks. And like this is a single domain that an attacker can just register and get all of these domains for free. The second option is to rename the name server to a random domain in a different top level domain. The different top level domain is to bypass the EPP check, and the random domain is so that you don't impinge on an existing domain. And in this case, like the registrar doesn't really have to handle any queries or upkeep any domains, but as you might have figured out, like there is a potential for security risk here. And of course, because it's the internet, we chose the second option, which is to just dump it into this random top level domain, .biz with a random domain. And because of this renaming, the host object is no longer a subordinate host object of foo.com, and the registrar can go ahead and delete the domain. And what we're left with is a sacrificial name server. And by design, this is a random domain, which is not registered. So an attacker can now go in and register this domain and be the authoritative name server for bar.com without having any ownership interest in bar.com. Okay. And we found that this mental model actually explained most of the renamings that we saw, but then we started seeing renamings that affected .gov, .edu, .net, and we found that the one small tiny adjustment that we needed to make in our mental model was that EPP instances span multiple top-level domains. So for example, VeriSign's EPP repository spans .com, .gov, .net, .edu, amongst others. And Affiliates, for example, spans .org, .info, and amongst others. So what we'll do is sort of try to rework the example again to see how this renaming affects domains across multiple top-level domains. So in this case, we have a .com domain, a .gov domain, and a .org domain, each of which delegates their name service to ns2.foo.com. And like before, foo.com expires. The registrar renames ns2.foo.com to drop this host to ns2.foo randomcharacters.biz. And this renaming only affects the VeriSign EPP repository because that's the scope of it. And on the other hand, for the .org, we're still left with a lame delegation. And each of us can be registered and by an attacker to be the authoritative name server for even a .gov domain. So here's a quick summary of what we have learned so far. We found that EPP consistency constraints led to unintuitive consequences on domain deletion. There were security risks without any action from the domain owner, and this was completely opaque to the domain owner and even to the domain owner's registrar. And perhaps the most insidious part of this was that re-registering the expired domain foo.com does not really fix the issue here. And what was surprising to us was that it affected even domains in restricted top-level domains like .gov and .edu. And we actually found a couple, and like the wonderful folks who are at VeriSign, who I can see here, actually helped us remediate some of them, or all of them. So given that we understood how this happened, we wanted to understand the scope of this issue and do so longitudinally. So we used the 3 properties of sacrificial name servers, which is not really important for this presentation, but we used this 3 properties and sort of modified a methodology to identify lame delegations from one of our previous papers and applied it to 9 years worth of zones files spanning 1,250 top-level domains, and applied it to 20 million name servers. And doing so, we found quite a few registrars actually indulging in it, 180,000 name servers, and 500,000 domains that were affected as a result of these renamings. And I just want to say, like, all of these registrars who we contacted were actually super helpful and like helped us understand the issue and actually rectified all of it. So this was great. So like, I know that this paints them in a bad light, but actually they were super helpful and super fun. So given that not only were 500,000 domains affected, but nearly 1/3 of all of the domains were hijacked by registering the sacrificial name servers. So not only were these domains being exposed, but they were in fact being taken advantage of. And these were not really sophisticated hijacks. The hijackers essentially were trying to get hold of these domains in order to serve ads, and where search engine optimizations were the other use case that we saw. And essentially, these were opportunistic hijacks. So like basically, there was nothing targeted, there was nothing malicious. They saw this domain being exposed. And we see that domains attackers trying to maximize how many domains that they can get for a single registration. And in the paper, we have some sort of value curve where we see attackers trying to go for the high value domains. So given that we understand the scope of this issue, we wondered if we could help remediate this issue. And this remediation roughly takes 2 forms. The first is to prevent creation of new sacrificial name servers. And to do that, we worked with the 3 registrars with the largest impact to prevent creation of new sacrificial name servers. And each of them used a different flavor of sync domains. And so far, as a result of this intervention, like we have prevented 30,000 domains, I think as of last year, from being prevented from being hijackable. And also the registrars used different sort of renaming idioms. And like more interestingly, GoDaddy used AS112.ARPA, which was a topic of big debate in DNSOP yesterday. So I thought that was interesting. And the enum and internet.bs like used regular old domains. The second form of remediation was to how do we go about fixing the currently hijacked domains that were pointing to name servers where attackers had actually taken over the name servers. So in this case, we created per registrar lists of affected domains. We made them available to the registrar community, and there were some notable remediation efforts by GoDaddy and Mark Monitor, because we saw, I think they saw a lot of domains that were hijacked that had quite a bit of value. But none of these solutions really are long-term solutions. And I'd like to emphasize the fact that sync domains are not a good long-term solution. There are multiple instances, as I had mentioned before, of sync domains becoming available for registration as registrars sort of move to newer domains. And in this case, a single registrant gets all of the domains. And we have a few suggestions for long-term solutions in the paper. One of this could be a .alt TLD, again, which has been discussed in the DNS op working group. I think Warren and Paul have been working on an RFC, and it's like in its draft stages. And the second potential solution could be just, delete the host object without trying to rename it. And we're not entirely sure of what the potential implications could be for that. So something to study. But the thing to note here is that each of these potential long-term solutions need to be codified as a change to EPP. Not only does this prevent relapse to old renaming idioms, but also because not all EPP instances support the proposed solutions. So some of this is going to take rejiggering on our part. And this seems like quite a heavy lift for this specific issue. Like changing EPP, changing all of these EPP instances seems like a heavy lift for this one specific issue. And so the way I decided to approach this was to sort of zoom out and see and try to look at some of the other problems that are surrounding the same issue, and see if we could come up with solutions that are more holistic. And what I'd like to do now is to sort of switch gears a little bit. And so far, I've been talking about opportunistic hijacks. And what I'd like to do now is to briefly talk about targeted hijacks, where attackers have a goal. Attackers come in and want to target a specific domain and do so. And if there are any lessons that we can learn from there, so that if we're going to revisit these protocols, then we should do so in a way that solves both of these problems. And a lot of you might be familiar with targeted hijacks because of this Department of Homeland Security's emergency directive asking government domains to evaluate their DNS infrastructure for signs of tampering. In January of 2019, this was what CISA published. Around the same time, there were multiple security vendors such as Cisco Talos, CrowdStrike, and FireEye, which published multiple reports of widespread DNS hijacking activity targeting multiple sectors across multiple countries. And the hijack of the French aerospace company was perhaps like the first documented instance of a domain hijack. And what I'd like to do is to sort of work through this 2014 hijack as an example of how this attack typically plays out and what the attacker is trying to achieve, and what could be good mitigation strategies for it. So let's say you're a client trying to log into the secure network for this French aerospace company. Essentially, you're trying to load up this login page in order to enter your credentials. And to do that, you need to first resolve secure.snecma.fr, which is where this domain lives. And in order to do that, the client sends off this request to the recursive resolver. And we are all familiar with how this resolution process takes place. The recursive resolver does this dance with all of the authoritative name servers, gets an IP address, caches it, and sends it back to the client. And then the client web browser goes to this IP address, loads up the login page, and then is able to sort of enter credentials and get in. Now let's see what happened in 2014. In 2014, attackers were able to maliciously update DNS delegations at the top-level domain authoritative name servers. And I want to make sure that you folks are aware of this key difference. Unlike DNS cache poisoning or query interceptions, which target the DNS query protocol. In this case, the attackers target the registrars and the registries in order to influence the delegation at the top level domain authoritative name server. So this is not a query protocol attack. This is a social engineering, a supply chain attack, if you will, where the attackers target the registrar and the registry in order to influence the top level domain delegations. And now, because the attackers actually control the authoritative name servers, they can redirect all users trying to resolve that domain to an IP address of their choice. And now the web browser is going to go to this malicious IP address and load a web page that looks awfully similar to the actual login page, but is in fact malicious. And at this point of time, a lot of you must be asking, isn't this exactly what TLS is supposed to help us with? Like, how is this new? How does TLS not help us with this? And it turns out that TLS would have helped had it not been for this unfortunate trust dependence between certificate issuance and DNS. So it turns out that certificate issuance, automated certificate issuance, uses DNS to prove domain ownership. And since attackers actually control the DNS, they can obtain TLS certificates for the domain. And keep in mind, like, these are completely legitimate certificates, maliciously obtained, but legitimate certificates nevertheless. And as a result, users can't really distinguish between legitimate infrastructure and attacker infrastructure. The only silver lining in all of this is the fact that certificate transparency, allows for auditing of all of the certificates that were issued and sort of helps us in being able to identify these hijacks and so transparency plays a big role in us being able to identify these hijacks. Okay, so a quick summary of like these targeted infrastructure hijacks. They start by an attacker acquiring ability to control DNS delegations. These hijacks are characterized by multiple brief updates. So instead of hijacking for a period of a day, they prefer to do it a few hours over a period, few hours every day over a period of weeks, so as to not attract attention. And more importantly, because they control the DNS infrastructure, they can bypass DNSSEC, TLS, they can just disable it or bypass it. And there is this parallel attacker infrastructure, which is to mimic the target domain. And this responds with a maliciously obtained TLS certificate, which basically means like they cannot be distinguished from the legitimate infrastructure. And once you have the redirected users, you can either compromise them or harvest credentials with the ultimate goal of infiltrating the target organization. And so with this understanding of targeted infrastructure hijacks, oh, I went way too far. Okay. Okay, now, sorry, I sort of, spoiler alert. We wanted to construct, we wanted to construct a methodology to retroactively identify these targeted domain hijacks in the wild and as an independent third party. And I'm not going to go into the details of how we did it. Happy to talk about it. The link to the paper is in the slides. But in all, we identified 41 domains as hijacked. 33 of these domains we were able to independently re-identify and verify from previously published reports. I think we were able to independently re-identify nearly all of the domains that were previously published, and 8 domains that were not previously identified or at least not reported. And we think that these are high confidence, and like each of them is manually evaluated. There are many, many, many more domains where there is circumstantial evidence, but we just didn't feel confident enough to consider them as hijacked. And this is one of the limitations of being an independent third party. So to give you a sense of what is it that the data that we were able to find. So here is an example of 4 domains that we identified as hijacked, all belonging to .kg, which is the Kyrgyzstan government. 3 of them were government domains. 1 of them was an infrastructure provider in Kyrgyzstan. And we find that each of them was targeted from the same network, geolocated to Russia, each of them targeting the mail infrastructure. I just want to be careful here. The geolocation is not to denote attribution, but in each of these cases, the mail infrastructure was the one that was targeted. And for example, for Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Kyrgyzstan, they used Zimra as their mail provider, and we find that the attacker sort of setting up this parallel infrastructure with that mimics the Zimra mail login page, and sort of prompt malicious downloads or harvesting user credentials. And I don't expect any of you to read this, but this is like the entire list of 41 domains. So if you have the slides open on your computer, you can sort of go over the slides. The only thing that again that you might be able to see is some of the patterns that sort of emerge: a lot of government domains, a lot of mail infrastructure, a lot of reuse in the same attacker infrastructure, which was surprising. But roughly speaking, this is an ongoing issue and something that's actually been becoming more problematic over time. So if I were to summarize this targeted hijacks part, I would say like the thing that we as a community need to sort of grapple with is the fact that the traditional mechanisms such as DNSSEC and TLS don't really protect against these DNS infrastructure hijacks, since attackers are able to sort of go and disable these protections, and that there is a need for more transparency and proactive measurements to understand how to mitigate these future attacks. And I thought now that we understood what the bigger issues were, and Christmas is near, I should come up with a wish list. And I'm told that the IETF Santa only deals with RFCs. So I thought, how about I come up with what I would like to see? So there were 3 things. And the DNS transparency, I've realized after talking to a lot of people, is an overloaded term. And I think I should have renamed it to EPP transparency, since it sort of builds up on some of the EPP changes that we're thinking of. But I'm not going to belabor the EPP point. It is to essentially codify changes so that we don't create new sacrificial name servers. The added thing that we can sort of think there is, can we sort of think about mechanisms to have consistency across top-level domains? But sort of building up on top of it, so DNS transparency, but specifically EPP transparency, to make sure that all of the changes that are made to name servers get published, so as to make sure that organizations know what their name servers look like at any given point of time. So if you sort of think about, does IETF.org know what the name servers for their domain are? We would like to think that they haven't changed. But unless you go and actually check the .org top-level domain authoritative name servers, there is no way to know for sure. And essentially, this sort of transparency is a way to get visibility into any changes that are being made in the duration that you're not checking. And I think the best analogy that I've come up with is that this is to think of this as a supply chain attack, and having this transparency allows organizations to convince themselves that nothing really has changed, assuming, of course, that you trust the registry. But assuming that you do, I think this sort of transparency is important for organizations to convince themselves. And what we can envision is something like an append-only log with all of the changes to name servers being recorded. And finally, this is certificate transparency on steroids. Certificate transparency has been great to identify bad actors, and a lot of work wouldn't have been possible without certificate transparency. And it turns out that certificate authorities do a lot of work when they issue certificates, and if they made it sort of public or at least available to researchers, such as DNS queries and the IP which initiated the requests, we would be able to get a better sense of like what exactly might be happening. And with that, I just want to say, before I go for questions, I just want to thank all of my collaborators who are the only reason why I'm here. And with that, I think I'm happy to take questions. And
Okay, thank you, Gautam. Excellent talk. So if there are questions, please do join the queue using MeetEcho and come to the microphone. While we're waiting for people to join the queue, I'd like, though, to remind people of the masking policy for the room. If you're not an active speaker at the front here, you need the community guidelines is that you need to wear a mask at all times, and the mask needs to cover your nose and your mouth. And if you're not willing to do that, then please leave the room. All right, see we have some people in the queue. First up in the queue is Dwayne. How do we work the queue? Dwayne, if you can ask your question. You're in the room, okay.
Hi, Gautam. Great talk. But I really want to push back strongly on the alt TLD idea because that is really designed for non-DNS use cases, and this would be very much a DNS use case, which would, generate lots of traffic that we really wouldn't want to have to see. So.
Right. So my understanding of .alt was that the recursive resolvers would drop it, and in a way, this would be like a graveyard. Like this is where you would send domains that you don't want resolved, and in a way, you don't want these domains to be resolved. But
yeah,
but again,
I think that's the ideal. But the draft at this point, which is still a draft, obviously, but doesn't say that resolvers have to drop it. So
okay.
I think it's at this point it's not a good fit.
Okay.
So there should be other ideas, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to. Like again, I'm excited that people are interested in actually making these updates. So like I'm happy to talk more on like what exact solution. Like there are a few more solutions that we had thought through, but again, like it's always great to come to IETF and actually understand the practical considerations of it. So
yeah,
happy to chat.
Okay, thanks.
Richard Wilhelm, PIR. One, great talk. Thank you. A couple things. One, I just plus one Dwayne's comment on the .alt thing. There's not really any musts in that draft right now, and I think that the idea in the paper about .invalid was probably, I like that one better for what it's worth. A couple things. In the slides, it had an example about the multiple providers and platform communication between providers. Even at a single registry service provider, often platforms aren't often connected. So whether it be at VeriSign or Affiliates or whatever, the platforms don't necessarily connect. So it's just a yes and to the point that you were making about platforms not having communication. So great point there, just something else for that. It may be a solution, it might be just dropping the name server. Originally, EPP had a requirement of having 2 name servers for DNS reliability. As you know, that was written before the days of widespread Anycast adoption. So one might argue that that's outdated. But even so, there's corner cases where you could end up having that, meaning a name going dark. The idea of communicating all domain deletions gets very challenging because the notion of when a domain gets deleted is remarkably fuzzy at registry platforms. Then the last point I'd like to make, and just probably for everyone within earshot, is, as you point out very well in your slides, especially, the integrity of the registrar account is so key to the underlying infrastructure, as you point out in your example there. And so if you've got registrations that are under your control or around you with your company, wow, if you don't have multi-factor authentication on that account, you're just asking for it. So if you're, I would just sort of a plea to everybody that does a lot of infrastructure, you should really work on locking down those domains as best you can. Thank you.
Right. So a couple of things there. Actually, great points, and I'm like, thank you for the feedback. For the multi-factor authentication, I think totally. I think the registrant account compromise. I think that's a big problem, and multi-factor authentication definitely needs to be adopted. But then there is also the issue of registrars themselves being compromised, and we see like in a lot of these cases, EPP tokens themselves being sort of exfiltrated by attackers, nation-state actors, and that. But that said, like registrant account security is an important is an important factor in all of this. Elliot.
Hey, Gautam, great paper and great presentation. One of the things that occurs to me when I read and watch your presentation is what we're seeing, is, particularly the first part of your presentation, is that we're seeing the aging of the internet. And what that raises a question in my mind about the externalities that are being introduced within the system at a fundamental level, you know, between ICANN and the registries, relating to is it really is it just an externality at this point that we're addressing in terms of when a name goes away? Is it simply, you know, if the reputational damage isn't there for the domain that's gone away, right? They've gone away. They don't care about their reputation, but the harm may accrue to others in terms of what happens next if somebody reuses that domain. And now there are two sides of this, right? You mentioned there's this, you know, use of a domain name server, right? There probably are some best practices that need to be applied there. I like the idea of dropping the name for that purpose. I'd rather the damage occur more quickly than and more transparently than say it being hidden. But there is this other aspect. I just tickled in my head as possibly some further research for the ICANNites to think about.
Yeah, and I think Rick also made this point about like dropping the name server, and like originally EPP did not allow it because of the requirement of 2 name servers. But in this case, one could argue that the second name server is actually serving no purpose. Like it is a lame delegation. It's not going to resolve, and just having there is a waste of space. And actually, it might be better to make it more clear that this is a dead delegation. So yeah, good point. Thanks.
Ralphio Akamai. So like to echo what my previous speaker said, AS11, the .alt is not the solution you're looking for. The reason also, resolvers never would get asked for the name server's name. They would internally resolve it. So that's a different kind of code path. So I think GoDaddy did the right thing. They used AS112.ARPA, which is kind of like, yeah, that's the sinkhole that we use for all things in DNS.
Right. And so when we spoke to other people about AS112.ARPA, the hijackability of AS112.ARPA domains was not immediately obvious to us. Like, since there is a sinkhole server that is localized, does it sort of expose domains to some sort of localized hijacking control? We couldn't say, but yeah.
If you're having AS112 in your network, you control. DNS is unencrypted most of the time still, so you can do that anyway, right?
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody. Excellent set of questions. I'd just like to give you a small token of our appreciation, and thank you once again. Next up is Corinne. Do you have control? Do you want to cancel it and I'll read it? That's it. All right.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Hang on.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Gok.
You're clearly jumping the gun here. So the second talk today is by Corinne Caff. Corinne is a research affiliate at the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge, where she studies internet governance cultures. Corinne's talking today about the technology we choose to create, human rights advocacy in the IETF. This paper was originally published in the Telecommunications Policy Journal in 2021. It's also available as, I think it's chapter 7 of your PhD thesis. We link to your thesis on the website in an open access form if you want to read the details. And again, if you find this work interesting, I think you're talking in HRPC on Friday as well. So there'll be similar topics, I guess.
Yeah, okay. Good to go. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for being here this morning and for being with me. It is day 3 of the IETF, and I've already been able to lose my voice. So we're gonna try this slowly as I sip some water. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to present my work today. As Colin already mentioned, my paper is called "The Technology We Choose to Create: Human Rights Advocacy in the IETF." Now, I've been participating in the IETF since 2014, which in IETF terms makes me a very recent participant. And my work, my research work has been generously funded by the Ford Foundation. And I want to thank Michael Brennan and Laurie McClinchy in particular for believing that this is important work. Now, I wrote both my master's thesis and my PhD about the IETF. And the work that I'm presenting today is part of that work, and it really delves into the cultural aspects of the IETF, and in particular, why engineers choose to create and develop and standardize particular technologies, and what sometimes unspoken values drive these choices. But before I dive into my paper, I want to draw some attention to the ongoing hunger strike of Alaa Abdel Fattah. Alaa is an Egyptian-British activist and technologist who has been imprisoned in Egypt unjustly for over 9 years for his work on human rights and internet freedom. He's a friend to many of us, some of us in the room as well. And I want to put this on the radar for you, especially because we are in the UK and he's a dual citizen. And if you have any of your representatives or politicians going or being at COP27, please reach out to them and see if they can plead the case for Alaa to be freed. Now, it might feel like a bit of a hard pivot to go from this call to free Alaa to my paper presentation, but I promise there's a red thread there in terms of the importance of considering the impact of technology on human rights. So my talk today has 4 sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about anthropology. I'm an anthropologist by training. I'm going to give some context for the research that I did, talk a little bit about the findings in this paper, and then move to conclusions, but more importantly to the Q&A, because I'm really interested in having the conversation with the community, and that's really why I'm here. As I mentioned, I'm an anthropologist. I am currently a research affiliate at Cambridge. Some of you might also know me in the context of my day job as the VP of Research at the Open Technology Fund. I want to make clear, though, that I'm presenting this not in that capacity, but as a lapsed or lapsing academic. And it's interesting, it was really wonderful to hear Gautam's talk before me, because I'm going to riff a little bit on the story that he was trying to tell from 10,000 feet. So the story that I want to tell is really about how well-meaning people have practices that sometimes have unintended consequences. So for those of you who've never met me, who don't know my work, you might also know me as the cat's pet that gets quoted a lot on IETF threads about what is and what isn't good etiquette. Most recently on this IETF at IETF thread that I'm sure more of you than not don't need to be reminded of. This quote in particular, incidentally, refers to another piece that I have written about IETF culture, called What's Wrong with Loud Men Talking Loudly, the IETF Culture Wars. You can find a link to that piece on the slide, and I'm super happy to talk about that as well. So one of the things that I love to do in my talks is preview a little bit of the key takeaway. And the key takeaway for this talk today is somewhat of a controversial one, at least in this community. If there's one thing that I hope sticks with you today from my talk, it is that the IETF's work is political, much as there is a mantra here that says we don't do politics. And I want to be really clear about what I say when I mean political and politics. So for me, that means that the work is infused with historically contingent power relations and the values, the personal values, the political values held by its participants. So I'm talking about politics in terms of values and power relationships, not necessarily in terms of political parties, just to make that clear. Now that I've situated myself within the community, I want to talk a little bit about why the IETF is such a fascinating place for anthropologists. And I'm going to do that by taking a really quick dive into some important developments in the field of anthropology, sort of starting since the 1970s. But bear with me, I promise we'll get to 2022 in a second. Now, many people see anthropologists as social science researchers who go off to remote islands to study people who are very different from us. To study sort of the Argonauts of the Western Pacific, to bring in some classical anthropological work. And whilst this once was largely the focus of anthropologists, a lot has changed, especially since the 1970s, when there was a switch in the field from that kind of research to studying up and studying in our own societies, meaning studying those more powerful than us within the context in which we ourselves are native. So that means nowadays you will find us everywhere. We are studying the US government, we are studying the European Union, we are studying Netflix, Meta, Apple, wherever we can enter. So the well-known tech companies, but also lesser well-known communities like the IETF. And one of the interesting things is, like IETF engineers, anthropologists of technology get together and have beer and gossip and trade war stories. And the interesting thing is when I do that with fellow anthropologists who are in this field and we share our war stories, I often get asked, how do you deal with the hostilities that many anthropologists experience being social scientists who study technical communities? And one of the things that always tends to surprise my colleagues is that I say, I've actually found the IETF to be very receptive of my work and very curious about it, even if we don't always agree. I don't think I would be here receiving this prize if that wasn't the case. And I'm very appreciative of that reality. And I think part of the reason why is because when the IETF started, it was really a wild band of scientists from all sorts of different disciplines. In the time that I've spent here, I've interviewed astronomers, philosophers, other anthropologists, people coming from a wide array of academic backgrounds, and bringing those very interesting and diverse perspective to the work that is done here. Now, this is a quick what, how, why of anthropology slide. For those in the room who are less familiar with it as an academic discipline. So let me give you a really quick sort of bird's eye overview. What anthropologists do is that we study human behavior and cultures, and we do that through direct engagement with humans. So by participating in their worlds, so in my case, I've spent 3 years doing field work within the IETF, and by doing in-depth interviews and other types of field work. And what really, that allows us to really draw out the cultural conditions that shape society. And that's what I hope to make concrete in the paper that I'm going to be presenting today. I really try to demonstrate how issues like autonomy, freedom, and choice are valued in the IETF and how that impacts the technology that we choose to create. Now, I'm not entirely sure how well you can read this slide, but this is a picture that I took during, I think, the 2019 IETF presentation in Prague. And the slide has 3 columns outlining a conversation between A and B. Let's go with Bob and Alice. The first column outlines what Alice said in the meeting. The second column outlines what Bob thinks Alice said or is trying to say. And the third column outlines what Alice is truly saying, what she truly means to say. So, for example, in the first column, it says that Alice told Bob, "I have a few comments." And what Bob heard was, "Please rewrite this draft entirely, thank you." But what Alice truly meant is, "I found some typos." And what anthropologists try to do is really to get at that third column, trying to understand what people truly mean and what values and politics drive those views. So, putting all of that information in the context of my paper on the technology that we choose to create. I have a bit of a schematic overview of the kind of questions that anthropologists ask and the kind of answers that I've given in the context of this paper. And in particular, my research has looked at how IETF engineers have responded to the attempts of human rights activists to include human rights considerations in the IETF's work. So here we go. So anthropologists ask questions like, what do people care about? What beliefs do they hold? And how do these beliefs inform cultural practices? For instance, the cultural practice of developing protocols and standards. Now, in this particular case, I found that a lot of the people here care about freedom, autonomy, growth of the network, and having the choice, and also leaving the choice to people who end up implementing protocols. Some of the beliefs that they hold are that these particular things, freedom, autonomy, growth, and choice, is what make the best functioning internet for all of us. And these beliefs inform the cultural practices of standardization, in this particular case, by bolstering some of the resistance against the human rights work. Now, what I show throughout the paper is that there were clashes between some of the engineers and the human rights activists, as many of the engineers felt that the demands that the human rights activists were making were not just technically unfeasible, but rather would require them to move away from some of these values that they cared about and see as key to good protocol development. Or to put it in other words, what my paper tried to show is that it's not just that the human rights activists were perhaps asking engineers to do things that they thought were technically unfeasible, but rather that the things that they were asking were culturally undesirable. So that brings me to the second part of my talk, where I provide a little bit more context for the research that I've been doing, because I know that perhaps not everyone is equally familiar with the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group and other activities of folks who come from a public interest background in the IETF. So here we go. Too fast. So in October 2014, 3 human rights activists presented a bold idea to the IETF. They wanted to do research on how internet standards impacted human rights. Initially, they had wanted to directly set up a working group in the IETF, but it was decided that it would perhaps be better suited to be a research group first. So what the activists try to do is that they've developed guidelines that engineers could use to think through the potential impact of the work that they were doing on a number of human rights. And to achieve that goal, the activists set up the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group in the IRTF. The group is still doing a lot of work, and I'll be presenting some of my research there on Friday for people who are interested. I think it's the morning slot. So how should we see this particular group within sort of the larger history of the IETF? Now, during its 30+ year of existing, there have always been people working alongside industry engineers here who come from organizations that maybe aren't corporations. So I'm sure many of you know DKG, who works for the ACLU, Mallory Nodal, who works for the Center for Democracy and Technology. And their presence here is not novel in any kind of way. That being said, the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Group was one of the first to be so explicit about having a human rights mandate. And so what happened in October 2017, 3 years after they had initially started the work, After a lot of online and offline discussions, the advocates published their first industrial-only RFC 8280 research into human rights protocol considerations. And this outlines the guidelines that they hope would encourage engineers to think through the impact of their work. Now, after the publication of this human rights guiding document, there was limited uptake of it. I mean, very few standards that I've seen at this point have a human rights considerations section, like they do privacy considerations or security considerations. And there are many reasons why the human rights work faced such an uphill battle. Now, obviously, some are related to sort of the political economy of standardization, the dominance of the interests of particular technical actors and industry actors whose main concerns are around efficiency and cost and latency. But others, and this is the work that I've been focused on, are related to the cultural conditions in the IETF and the particular values and worldviews that many IETF engineers bring to the work they do, whether they acknowledge it or not. Now, in my paper, I consider openness, interoperability, permissionless innovation, and connectivity as four sort of important properties or ideal outcomes that engineers strive towards. And what I do is that I outline how a distinct difference in understanding of what these desired properties mean have led to constant friction between the human rights activists and some of the engineers who are participating in this debate. Or, to put it in other words, as I already mentioned, it's not just that the human rights activists asked engineers to do things that they didn't think were technically feasible, but that they asked them to do things that they didn't feel comfortable doing because it didn't align with their worldview of what their role should be. In the interest of time, I will skip this one. So that brings us back to column 3. Remember the different columns that I outlined earlier and how I am interested as an anthropologist in understanding what people mean and how that drives their work. In doing so for this paper, I found that there were big differences between how some of the human rights people interpreted openness or interop or connectivity versus how some engineers understood it. And these are some of the examples that I outline in the paper. So for instance, when talking about connectivity, many of the engineers talk about connectivity of machines, not necessarily of humans, and connectivity in a laissez-faire kind of manner. So not too much oversight, not too much intervention. Permissionless innovation really should not be centrally organized, but should be done because people choose to connect to the network. And openness really as freedom from coercion, including sometimes from human rights concerns. Now, unearthing what engineers probably mean when it comes to openness and interoperability and connectivity is important to understand the cultural causes of friction in research groups and working groups beyond just the ones that I've outlined here today. So to make it a little bit more concrete, for example, when talking about permissionless innovation, many engineers I interviewed talked about the ability of the individual to connect networks or innovate by building applications or services that run on top of the internet without permission from a central authority. And they actually believe that introducing human rights considerations in the IETF could undermine that type of innovation, as the framework for human rights is one that is sort of rooted in centralized authority, like human rights law, supported by a large number of centralized institutions like the United Nations. Or, as one of my interviewees said, I am not convinced human rights fit within the IETF. I am willing to be told otherwise, but when we talk about the political world of human rights, what comes to my mind quickly is the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, or something like that, in which the question becomes, Madam Chairwoman, I would like to speak about the gentleman from Slobovia who just said something with which I disagree. So overall, this meant that many who were participating in these discussions saw the human rights efforts as overly normative. in a way that didn't fit with the IETF's existing cultural approach to technology development. And again, as one of my interviewees said, the problem is that the Human Rights Protocol guidelines will be seen as didactic by the community that it is trying to influence. And far from achieving what it wants, there is a risk that it could backfire. It gives ammunition to the enemies of groups like HRPC at times. So the TLDR of this is a lot of the struggles that happen here are because of a clash of worldviews, and those play out by way of protocols. So it's politics by way of protocol, something that Professor Laura Denardis has long focused her work on for people who are interested in reading more about this from a social science perspective. Now, this clash of worldviews is not the only reason why the human rights advocates struggled, but it is important to show how worldviews factor in to protocol development. So what? This is always the question. So what? Why does any of this matter? Why do we need to know this? The influence of these cultural aspects of the IETF inform technical decisions, or rather that are inherent to technical decisions, provide insights into how and when the IETF is political. And this matters because the IETF's response to some of the human rights efforts and their sort of dismissal of it to a certain extent, in part comes from their belief that the approach of human rights activists would require a shift in their cultural understanding of desired protocol properties in internet architecture. Now, many engineers are hesitant to make that shift for fear of how it would change how the IETF operates today, or even affect the internet's overall technical functioning and the economic and cultural imperatives that undergird it. Or in other words, the protocols that are developed are about the technology that the IETF and its engineers choose to create, not just the technology that is possible. And I think this matters because it truly allows us to have a deeper, more honest conversation about whose values and priorities shape the work that we all do here and thereby shape internet architecture, and how reflective those are of the concerns of the majority of individual internet users who are not present in the rooms here. And that is actually where I want to bring my talk full circle. I started my talk with a call to learn more about the case of Alaa Abdel Fattah and his unjust imprisonment, because we're meeting in the UK. But also because I wanted to highlight the hostile realities that many internet freedom activists face when calling for human rights protections from their governments. Similarly, I could have started my talk by speaking about the situation in Iran, but I think that Simone Basso from UNI and Masa Ali Mardani have already done so really well yesterday at the IETF Open meeting. That really conveys the importance of us, at least as a community, thinking through the potential human rights ramifications of our work, even if the conclusion is that we might not be able to remedy things. So instead, I will end on this note. While in part my research aims to speak to the IETF community, it also aims to provide a roadmap for newcomers, especially those who are representing end users from regions that experience surveillance and repression, and to help them understand how to be effective in this community and what cultural barriers they must overcome to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Corinne. Excellent talk as always. Does anybody have any questions?
Sorry, I didn't have the tool up. Rich Sauls. So I noticed you said a couple times we, and that you are also a candidate for IAB. Does being part of the community affect your independence as an anthropologist?
And this is a great and beautiful question because anthropologists don't pretend to be independent. Anthropologists as a field is inherently aware of the fact that research is always political, that my worldviews and who I am will influence what my focus is in the research. So I don't pretend to be independent or politically neutral. Instead, what anthropologists and a number of other social scientists do is that we're very explicit about our positionality. So what you will find in my PhD research is a positionality statement in which I, for instance, outline how the different ways in which I am seen impact my research. A good example that I always bring up is obviously I identify as a woman, and that means that I am a minority in the IETF in some ways. I'm also white. That makes me part of a particular group within the IETF as well. I am from Europe. All of these things influence how I look at the world. And that is something I'm really explicit about in my research. Elliot.
Bryn, thanks very much for your paper and your work. I think you chose a group at a moment in time that this community struggled with greatly, quite frankly, and for many reasons, not just a single reason.
Yep.
Some of the reasons had to do with the responsibilities that we in this room have, not just toward individuals such as the one you mentioned, but also towards the day-to-day person who gets ripped off from, from fraud. We have a variety of responsibilities. I wonder if in your paper you were able to reflect that, because I haven't quite gone through the paper. It was a very difficult group for that, and there were other issues like with some of the quality of the research in some cases too.
Yep. No, I mean that is a very good point. As I mentioned, this paper is one part out of, I forget, 8 or 9 chapters of my PhD. Obviously, you can't fit everything into 10,000 words. That being said, I did focus very specifically on a certain subset. So I did focus on human rights activists in particular, because I do feel that in this community, people who represent that kind of end user in many ways are in the minority. And I feel the concerns that you raise are very valid. I also feel they are well represented, and not necessarily sure that it is my role to take on those concerns as well, given that everyone has a limited amount of capacity and 24 hours in a day.
Sorry, I'm just a little too short for the stand. My name is Michaela. Thank you so much for your presentation. My question, so coming from a human rights background, so less of a technical background, I'm very interested in what you were talking about, how in terms of the kind of differences in language, in terms of how you kind of, there's ways in which you can push for something as a human rights activist and that will not be interpreted always very well. And so I'm curious if you have any recommendations for kind of bridging that gap, or what us as human rights activists can do to kind of be able to work in a more collaborative and cooperative way with the IETF. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different recommendations that I would have, maybe something to talk about offline. I also have more of a policy paper coming out next year that specifically focused on some of the cultural hurdles that the IETF poses in terms of its sometimes rough working practices, and who those are for whom those are easier to navigate. Another thing that I've seen is very effective. I mean, everyone who represents different interests at the IETF sort of collaborates in ways to support each other. And there are groups that do the same thing for human rights activists. So again, let's talk about that. I'm happy to make some introductions there.
Okay, so a reminder that we have remote people too. So if you can use the tool for the queue. We have, is it AB on the remote, first of all? Abdul Salam, if you can go ahead.
Yes, I have a question regarding the April RFC. My understanding from reading the documents, I understand what the writer or the authors mean, and what they mean by as they see it as a tradition for IETF. But my opinion, and I would like my comment now to know your opinion as your expert these in societies or communities behavior. My understanding that at least the document, this RFC, which is in the 1st of April, to be notified that it's let's say for some kind of purpose on the document. But if you write a document and you just put the date, it's the 1st of April, so as saying it's they say it's a fool date or fooling date or funny date, day of fools or something like that. But in my, as an academic, I come from engineering academic background, I feel it's documents shouldn't be notified only by the date. At least give some kind of indication in writing some words saying this is in some kind of purpose, just like a title. So I want to know your comment on that. Thank you.
I am not 100% sure I could follow that because it's really hard to hear remote questions when you're up on the stage. But I think the question was, why did I organize to talk along certain dates for key documents? Or I don't know if anyone else in the room could hear what the actual question was. Gurshabat, could you repeat it?
I think the question was about April Fool's RFC and why they aren't. I mean, what I got is that they aren't like marked as somewhat distinct from normal RFCs, and people are supposed to understand the joke. That was
I think that might be a question for Lars and not for me.
Maybe a question for Elliot, actually.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Lars, so thanks, Corinne. This was a great talk, and in the great tradition of the IETF, I did not read your paper before coming to the microphone to comment on it, but that doesn't stop anybody anyway. So I liked the principles you identified for like what people believe the IETF is about. The one thing that I also think is maybe in your paper, which I don't know, is this multi-stakeholderism, right? That at least I believe there's this foundation there that like many of us believe that things get better and the consensus is stronger when we have a diversity of opinions and a diversity of participants in the room. And so I was in Colin's chair when HIPC started and I chartered it. And my sort of motivation at the time was sort of to challenge that belief a little bit, right? Because it can't just be lip service, right? And I was sort of excited when those participants showed up because that was an angle we really haven't had before. And I think it has made the IETF stronger. And I'm wondering, to come to my question, if in your interviews and your experience here, if you would say that we really like believe in multi-stakeholderism and it is a foundation for the work, or whether we pay lip service to it.
So I'm really interested in the fact that you choose the term multi-stakeholderism, because I know that some of the other internet governance organizations like ICANN are much more explicit in mentioning that as a key governance tradition. Whereas when I've spoken to people at the IETF, they say community-driven, bottom-up consensus, but multi-stakeholderism, like that particular term, is not used in the same kind of way, which in and of itself is an interesting kind of finding.
So I use the term because maybe I talk too much to these other groups now, and it's my belief the IETF actually was the original multi-stakeholder organization before we had that word. Yep. And I think that's why it's not so widely used. And other organizations have sort of now jumped on the bandwagon, let's say, and are trying to portray themselves as very open. I think there's an argument to be had whether they actually are quite as open as they claim to be, right? Because it's becoming a politically reason to be that. But I sort of wonder if sort of, if the IETF, I think we've always had this, openness that's now called multi-stakeholderism maybe. And I'm hoping it's really sort of a foundation of the work like these other things are. I wonder if you have opinions. But
so the interesting thing is that I found that there is a conflation within the IETF between being culturally welcoming and procedural openness. So I've had a lot of people tell me, to quote one particular person who said, any effort with an email can sign up to a mailing list. That is procedural openness. But then a lot of the folks that I've spoken to who are women, who are non-binary, who are people of color, not from the EU and the US, have said that's not openness when I experience sexism, when I experience microaggressions, when people make fun of my accent when I speak English, or because I'm not a native speaker, or because I am a native speaker with a distinct accent. So openness is a really thorny issue. And one of the things that I think the IETF still has a lot of ground to gain, because yes, we are open, but we are also a place where, you know, on an average meeting, 10% of the participants identify as women and the rest are men. How open are you if in practice there are all sorts of difficulties in getting getting and maintaining a diverse set of participants? So there is some openness along certain axes, but not on others, and there's real work to be done there.
Just a point of information, this is the independent submissions editor. If you have questions about April 1st RFCs, just contact me directly and I won't take up any more time in this meeting.
Okay. All right, thank you, Elliot. So we have we're running a little short on time. We have a remote question from Simone, and then the questions in the room, and then the queue is closed. And if you can be brief with your questions and answers, that would be appreciated.
All right, so I'll try to be brief here. Hi, Keith. I've seen your talk multiple times in multiple venues. So my question is very quick. Given that you've been navigating the structure in the IETF and trying to find out, try to discover basically your findings now, is there any initiative to keep this work alive inside the IETF? Like, we have a little bit of research work now trying to find out how the process of IRFCs get adopted, accepted, or evolved. So do you have any plans, or is there anybody inside the IETF that is interested in having your work alive or keep it alive?
Yeah, I have three really quick answers to that. Is the first, there's this, the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Group is ongoing work. There is I think it's a side meeting tomorrow of a group of folks called RASP that want to do research on standardization. Gur Shabat was over there, and I run a group called the Public Interest Technology Group, where we convene people who work on standards, not just at the IETF, but at a bunch of different places from a public interest perspective. And as Rich mentioned, for better or for worse, I am running for the IAB. So if you think that this research that I'm doing was terrible and you think it has no place in the IAB, or if you think this kind of a perspective has a place, then please feel free to send a little note to the NOMCOM about my potential candidacy.
Jefferson Aubrey, you mentioned ICANN, and also in this slide on the interview, I think the ITU is also mentioned. Could you tell more about similar initiatives to yours on other standardization bodies, if you are aware of?
There are, I mean, obviously ICANN has also a long history of people from a not-for-profit and a public interest perspective participating. They're divided into stakeholder constituency. There is the NCUC, which stands for the non-commercial users community. Someone from ICANN is going to throw something at me right now. The ITU is trickier because obviously you have to be on a national delegation to participate. That being said, some of the national delegations, for instance, the UK and the Netherlands, where I am from, allow civil society participants to join them on the delegations and actively participate in the negotiations. So Niels ten Oever, who was one of the founders of the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Group, was at the ITU plenipotentiary a couple of weeks ago. Memesh Ansari, who is the head of digital at Human Rights NGO Article 19, was also there. So these kind of initiatives exist across these bodies, but they run into different and similar barriers everywhere. For instance, the fact that civil society is very underfunded in comparison to other participants.
Thank you.
Okay, again, very briefly, please.
Hi, Goshabad Grover. I loved how you said when the IETF chooses to be political and when not. My question was, in your interviews, so another cultural practice is that people sometimes represent themselves as individuals and hide their affiliation. In your research, did you find that, and not just on human rights, but maybe you can answer, that people had a different position when speaking to you in private, where they sort of didn't have to represent a company or have an affiliation that everyone knows about, actually?
The brief answer is yes. And this is also why I think having anthropologists in spaces like this is so important. Because if you only look at the working group mailing lists or even the recordings of it, you don't get the entire picture.
Thank you.
Hi, Tail, David Lawrence. Real quick, I had so many different thoughts. One, I completely support your candidacy for the IB. I think it is something we need. I believed in multi-stakeholderism in the IETF for more than 2.5 decades now. And technology, it shares this duality, both by being neutral in and of itself, but completely greasing the skids for particular political agendas. And one of the main reason I wanted to get up to ask a question was, how do we get additional input from the other stakeholder groups? Do we need an outreach organization? Are they already aware and trying to make inroads here? Like, how do we further develop the inputs?
So I think that the IETF does that already pretty well. There are people here, for instance, Mallory Nodal, who's obviously on the IAB, but works for the Center for Democracy and Technology. And part of her role is also making sure that there are resources and information available to others who are interested in that. There's a need to scale it though. And there is the obvious difficulty that a lot of that, what we do here takes a lot of technical capacity that isn't necessarily present in the same way within civil society, plus the fact that there are many different challenges when it comes to technology. And obviously for many people, the most visible parts of the internet are the most obvious ones. So a lot of civil society organizations will focus on artificial intelligence, social media, and the things that we see. That being said, I think there are a lot of developments here that will impact our ability to sort of use the internet for ways that are important to human rights activists that we have a role to play in. And by we, I mean both me as an academic bringing that kind of work out, but also the human rights activists who are present here.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much for your talk.
Oh, that's wonderful. I appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Okay, next up is Daniel. Okay, thank you, Corinne. Excellent talk, excellent questions. We're running a little behind time. I hope you will give us the grace to run slightly over this session. The last speaker today, last but by no means least, is Daniel Wagner. We'll be talking about his paper, United We Stand, Collaborative Detection and Mitigation of Amplification DDoS Attacks at Scale. This was originally published in the ACM Conference on Computer and Communication Security, I believe, last year. Yes. Daniel is a doctoral student at the Max Planck Institute in the University of the Saarland in Germany, and he focuses on network measurement, traffic classification, and software-defined networking using novel programming languages. And he joined D6 in 2019 as a researcher and developer as of new products and solutions for internet exchange points.
That's absolutely right. Can I have control?
Yes, I need to pass them over.
There's basically nothing to add to that, what Colin said. So I do not need to introduce myself. I think I'm now in control of the slides. Yes.
You have control.
Well, first of all, thank you all very much for making all of this possible. Thank you for this kind of prize that you are awarding here. It's amazing. I did not imagine ever to receive something like that. So thank you all very much. And also thanks to my co-authors. Without these guys, nothing of that would have been possible. So I thank very much Daniel Kopp, Matthias Wichtelhuber, Christoph Dietzel, my fellow colleagues at DKIX, as well as Oliver Hohlfeld from the BTU, Georgios Maragdakis from TU Delft, and my doctoral supervisor, Anja Feldmann from the Max Planck Institute. All right. So the topic is once again about DDoS attacks. We're going to talk about why is that still a hot topic. This is still a not really well-solved problem in our internet and our today's internet that we have, and the volumes of the attacks and the damage that they cause is still on the rise. So we're seeing more and more reports on the web dating to, I don't know, now 3.47 terabit attacks to date. This is a volume that can take like also the very big players, at least for their scrubbing services, to an enormous test. For reference, a gigabit usually is enough to knock off some base services. I don't know, like some stores, web services, stuff like that. And this also targets basically everything that is hosted online, so more and more influencing more our daily lives. For example, financial services and even health sector is affected or can be affected by that. So what is the kind of DDoS attack we are going to dig into? This is a special kind of those attacks. There are many different types of that. We're looking at the amplification DDoS attacks, which work basically as follows. We've got an attacker to the left, and he sends small packets to a set of exploitable devices or services online that act as a reflector. And the attacker sets a spoofed source address so that the response of the reflectors, which is larger than the initial request, so say it's an amplification, can be directed to any target basically. And the target is then the service that the attacker wants to knock offline. So usually what is being done to defend oneself from that is that these services that want to remain alive, they deploy a local scrubbing service. I depict this in this figure as this purple box to the right. And if we assume that this scrubbing service did a perfect job, well, maybe they are doing a very great job, but they are never perfect. And even if they did a perfect job, we have lots of unwanted traffic along the paths. These are these blue arrows pointing to the right to the target. They are still carrying all of that unwanted traffic that has no use just to be, but to be dropped. So it's basically polluting the networks in between. And this is where our idea kicks in. Along the path between the reflectors and the target, there are so-called internet exchange points. So they are distributed somewhere along the path, as depicted in the figure. Some of the paths of the attack traffic are going around these IXPs, but along some of these paths the IXPs are located. And that's we were measuring about the position of the IXPs along the path, and also what could be the benefit of dropping the traffic earlier than at the local scrubbing service at the target. They have one problem to say is that they are not aware of the whole attack that is ongoing because they have a limited view of just the path of the traffic that is crossing through them, and they don't have the absolute view that the local scrubbing service had to the right. So we are measuring at first what is the distance between the reflectors to the IXP, and then from the IXP to the target, just to quantify how much earlier we can drop the traffic. And as I said, to come over the problem with the local, with the limited and local visibility, we're going to measure how much we could benefit if they can exchange their information in order to get a more sophisticated and more global view, the most global view that they can ever achieve if they combine all of the information. And lastly, we're going to dig into how this kind of information exchange could be done. So first of all, let's leverage some data. We partnered with 11 IXPs across the globe. Plus, well, that's way too much to say. It was in Central and South Europe and the North American countries, ranging from very different types of traffic. Lots of different numbers of peers there, different peak volumes, and different amount of flows we could get from them. And the time range we were looking at was a half a year in 2020. We were filtering for UDP only, because that is what most common amplification DDoS attacks are using as a transport protocol. And then we were filtering further for prominent, abusable, let's say like that, protocols that were derived from previous related work. This is a list of the protocols we were looking at and the port number. And lastly, we were also filtering for prominent packet sizes that are mostly transmitted when a exploited answer is being transmitted. So this is also for the protocols a certain thing we want to look for. Next, on the filtered data, we applied a detection mechanism, meaning that we are looking now for flows that are targeting the same IP address, but originate from at least 10 different sources that are the reflectors. And the absolute volume measured by that, or in sum, needs to exceed 1 gigabit of traffic. If we detect such an event, it is likely to be a DDoS attack. We chose our thresholds to be, let's say, rather conservative in order to reduce the number of false positives. When we did so, first look at the data we had half a year of data, and this is what it looks like. So the basic takeaway here is there are more than thousands of attacks every day, even though we had a very conservative filtering criteria up front. We had also a case study. We could correlate events that we had in our data with reports that were on the news. So here is, for example, an Akamai report that very much correlates. Like, this is exactly the attack. We're very confident with that. But they reported on, and we saw also in our data. Now, the takeaway here is basically that we have a site at which the traffic volume exceeds well beyond 10 gigabits per the attack vector. So that is locally easy to detect as such, because that is very likely to be unwanted traffic. But for the other sites, for example, we have here CE2, Central European 2, the IXP there, where the local detection would not be feasible, but still it's carrying the attack's traffic. That's basically the main motivation we have here. Further, you can see the complexity of the attack vectors themselves. So you're using coupled ports like 53, CLDAP, and other protocols. Like, they are very, very much mixed and very different protocol attack vectors involved in one attack. All right, the question is, how accurate are we with that? Because we wanted to reduce the amount of false positives. So we compared what we found to be an attack event with the benign data. That was all the data that was not caught, that was caught by a filter. So these are actually the protocols, so far so good, but it was not caught by a detection mechanism. So any of the patterns did not match. Was too few reflectors involved, and the absolute volume of 1 gigabit was not reached. So we then compared some statistics of the benign data, or the data we classified as benign, with the ones that were caught by the attack detection mechanism. And the main takeaway here is that for the benign traffic, we see a complete different picture than for the attack events that we found. So on the top left corner of that ECDF, we find that all the 3 lines for the benign data are stuck to the top left corner, whereas the attack data shows a more, I would say, a more diverse picture, meaning that there are more sites involved with more different port combinations involved. But if it's just a single site involved and it's benign data, it's to the top left. So now slides are flipped. Next, we fired up self-attacks in order to get some ground truth. So we attacked our own infrastructure. There's an ethical consideration section on the paper on that. We can definitely chat about that if you're interested in what we actually did, to derive actual attack data and compare it to what we classify as such. So by that, we derived lots of features. Here on the left, you have got some exemplary ones. We have 1,146 features derived, different statistics like the amount of ports, the duration of the attack, and so forth. And then we did a principal components analysis on the features that were resulting. To the right, you can see the top 3 PCAs being plotted, and we did clustering on that. And what we see is a clear visual separation of the benign attacks. It's a small green bump somewhere in the middle, and all of the attacks are very well clustered, and all of the self-attacks fall exactly into what we call attacks. Next, we compared the packet sizes for self-attacks. The boot services that we used for that did not offer every protocol that we were filtering for, so sometimes the blue bars are missing. But you can see for most of these, example, I give an example for CLDAP, that is port 389 in the center of the figure. We can see a very strong correlation between the blue and the red packet sizes that we observed, whereas the benign data is basically all over the place. So once again, a clear separation of a clear visual separation of what we call benign and what we call attack traffic. So now that we are confident with our data, we can now measure what we actually want to answer. First of all, we dug into the distance analysis. So that is seen from the route server. So we have a flow we consider to be an attack, and seen from the route server of the IXPs, we were counting the hops that it took from this IP address, from the reflector, to get to the IXP, and then to whatever IP address it is destined, how many hops it were there from the route service view to get there. I know that this assumes some caveats or some drawbacks, like symmetric routing, but so these numbers need to be taken with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, if we assume that all of the peers adhere to what the route service is saying, we could derive that at least for 45% of the attack, the volume originates from a direct member of the IXP. So the IXPs are very close to the reflector, meaning that they are a very good strategic position to drop the traffic early. And also for about 70% of the attacks, we found that the target is just 2 hops away. So also meaning that we are close to the target. Well, let's take away that we are well connected, I guess. All right, next thing, we were measuring the collaboration benefits. So now we've got lots of data. We can now pull it together and see what would have been locally seen and detected as an attack with a local threshold compared to if we combine all of the data and then apply the same threshold and then look at what IXP now with the global view of that traffic had been detected as an attack. So first of all, here's the graph that is the ground truth. If we combine all of the data we've got for each of the IXPs that we have, to the very left, we've got all of them combined. So that is the 100,000 attacks that we could, or events we could derive from our data. Next, we've got all but the largest one, that is CE1, just for a comparison. And then we've got all the individual sites, which are actually carrying attack traffic as per the global detection. And if we now compare this to local thresholds, various local thresholds, we find this picture. For example, you can see the prominent ones, I think, is CE3, where basically none of the actually, with a global view, detectable attacks are being detected, not even by 100 megabits threshold. For the far right one, CE1, because it's the largest one, it sees basically as much as we see with the combined data, for sure. But CE3 and CE4, they basically do not detect any of the attack traffic that they are actually carrying as such. So what's the collaboration benefit for let's say 100 megabits with the global threshold compared to the local one? And this graph depicts the amount of missed traffic. So now they are reordered for the ones to the left that missed the most. If I compare this to the globally detectable traffic, we find that for some sites, we see that 80% of the traffic is locally undetectable for this certain threshold. And then if we apply other thresholds, we even find a worse picture. For SE3 in this example, for a gigabit of threshold of 1 gigabit, we find that up to 90% of the attacks that were actually carried out by the IXP would have not been detected as such locally with a local threshold. Next, in order to exchange all of the information, we are proposing an exchange platform on that. This is the overall picture. Let's go through this slowly. Let's start with the top part, which is basically what Manners or similar endeavors are doing to date. There's a governance body on top because we do not believe that things like trust models or stuff or things like that can be carried out by machines only. So this needs manual or human involvement. So that's why we propose this government body that lives on top of it, and they define filters and thresholds. They are more or less building a community, just likewise to the IXP's community, because more peers accumulate an IXP, the more community grows and more attractive becomes for other peers. Same economy system is envisioned here. So the more people are involving in the DDoS information exchange point, the DXP, the more value or more attractive it might become to others to join. We believe that there's a need for contracts in order to get all of this running smoothly. So the government's body handles SLAs and also processes abuse cases. For the center part, we have 2 DXP members to the left and to the right. In the center, we have got the DDoS information exchange point for itself. And what they basically do is when they choose to collaborate with the DXP, so they become a member of it, then they adhere to the government's rules that were defined before. And then exchange the information about ongoing attacks that they can locally see, and then they publish it to a pub stream buffer, which is the actual database of this DXP, where they can also fetch information about ongoing attacks from there, and then if they are willing to do so, apply local filtering. We envision 2 different scenarios for that. So we envision a low trust scenario where the peers or the members of the DXP decide to just share information about the reflectors IP, because there are some, I would say, semi-sensitive information lists on the web where you can look for reflectors that have been successfully scanned by some guy. And so the sharing of the reflectors IP address is considered not too sensitive to whatever the extent that might be. And the second scenario is the high trust scenario where the peers choose to exchange all of the information about everything that they are seeing locally. That is the source and destination IP address, as well as the volume and the attack vectors of the ongoing attack. Lastly, we quantified the benefit of that. To the left, you can see an evaluation of the scenario of a low trust information exchange. And what we see is a clear benefit for all of the sites. We have once again the red bars that show the ground truth data of the actual attacks going on, and compared to what we saw before, now there are lots of more bars otherwise colored than red appearing, meaning that they can now see more than before, more of the attacks than before, just by exchanging the information. A short hint maybe on the boosted factor to the left. What does that mean is because the IXPs only see the reflector IPs, as I just explained, they might not see all of the traffic because maybe the shared reflector IPs are not visible at this local IXP. So we boosted what is remaining to be seen at this IXP in order to make CE1, that was our goal, reach once again for the blue bar, that is 1 gigabit threshold we initially used for, to reach again the 100,000 attacks that we see, because we know they see actually that much. But by boosting the traffic, we needed to be very careful not to run into false positives. And by manually inspecting, we saw that most of the attacks, but basically every of these attacks, I think 7 out of 900 that I inspected, were actually false positives, and all of the other ones were other DDoS attacks that were not caught by our very conservative filtering. To the right, the high trust scenario, we can see is more or less a linear incline of attacks that are now globally visible, because the more IXPs you add to the information exchange platform, the more information is shared and the more attacks can be detected locally. All right, so to wrap up this, we found about half of the attacks are located in more than 3 locations, putting strong interest on understanding more about the geographic distribution of the DDoS attacks, as well as the geographic distribution of the IXPs that are very useful along the path as a mitigation point. Next, we found that 80% of the globally detectable attacks would have not been detected locally because of the various IXP sizes. And we found that about 45% of the reflectors are just the next hop of the IXP. So that once again, emphasizing on the strategic role or the useful role in the position of the IXP along the path to drop the traffic early. And lastly, we proposed the DXP, which showed that 90% of more attacks can be detected locally due to the collaboration of the sites. I hope that this somehow gave you some interesting thoughts on collaboration and exchange information between IXPs in order to maybe have a chat on that and maybe standardize some things. I know that here in the IETF there are some endeavors ongoing on such information exchange proposals or protocols or alike. I'm very happy to have any conversations on that, and hope I finished more or less in time, because I know all of you are hungry and I want to get something to eat. And by that, I want to conclude my talk, thankfully, and I'm now very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Daniel. That was impressively on-time finish.
Thank you. I can do that.
Does anybody have questions for Daniel? And I'm afraid my machine has dropped off the Wi-Fi again, so I cannot see the queue very easily. But, the queue is empty online. Does anyone in the room have questions?
Hi, Robert Story, USC ISI. Have you talked to IXPs about interest in deploying this? The DXP solution? I mean, what kind of buy-in are you getting from them?
Oh, it's bad, like the speakers are away from me. So I should drop some words on the interest of IXPs.
Yeah, if you've talked to them about interest in implementing this and what kind of buy-in you're getting from them.
Some insights, all of the IXPs that we used in the collaboration were all DKICs, so yes, they were all interested. So we just talked to ourselves, basically. Thank you. Oh, that sounds nice. I can hear myself. I hope this answers your question. Boring but true, short answer. Sorry. Yes, please.
Hi, this is Corinne. I had a quick question, one researcher to another. What's the follow-up research you're going to do from this?
Now we're looking into telescope usability of combining or uniting IXPs. So we once again talked to ourselves, but now we've got 13 IXPs, upcoming work next year. The follow-up work here is maybe we can use a combined data set of all of the IXPs flow data that they see in order to get early detection for scanning activity, because we might know some telescope IP ranges and whether we see traffic that is going into a telescope at the IXPs, and we are going to measure to what extent that makes sense to also exchange telescope information between the IXPs. Now this is once again confirmation, not confirmation, but sensitive data that needs to be governed, and there's need for an exchange and of information on that again. But the overall endeavor is to mitigate or be prepared for DDoS attacks before they even arise, derived from scanning activity that we can see at the IXG. Please don't steal my idea. It's not published yet. Thanks. It's not my idea. It's George's idea.
Hi. So from what I understood, it looks more like you're looking at volumetric attacks at this point of time where this kind of a thing would work. So any thoughts on application layer attacks? Because from DDoS, the volumetric is kind of deviate you, and then the real attack is your application layer attack where the scrubbing center plays a major role. So that's my first question.
Can I
follow up?
Come on after that, because I don't like double questions. I always forget the first one. Very shortly is, yes, we are looking at volumetric attacks, that is amplification DDoS attacks, because the type of data we can get at the IXP is like very hard sample, huge sampling factors, and hugely aggregated. So things like packet attacks or SYN attacks, SYN floods or some case like that, they are just not visible with the database that we have. We are looking at volumetric attacks because they are from the database that we have more or less easily, I wouldn't say easy, but they are derivable at all. Other attack vectors are either invisible or our sampling methods that we have to apply, they just do not allow for any specific other things like that. So amplification and DDoS attacks are the low-hanging fruit to look at upfront. We might someday maybe invest more time in digging into other stuff or GPU, other layers. Problem with other layers is we do not see them at all. So application layer is absolute no-go. There's no way to get there. Layer 4 information is what it was quite a bit of a struggle to achieve, but we could do this now eventually. But layer 7 is no way for us to have any information on that. Okay. Second question, please.
And I think you kind of answered it, because my question was more on with increasing encrypted flows, quick adoption and all of that, the visibility is actually going to be much lesser even for ISPs. So in that context, where do you see the DDoS attack detection going, and any thoughts or do you have any plans on how to handle that problem? Like, given that you don't have visibility at this point, maybe you can, but
I'm not too sure. With regard to extending the visibility, I think this is basically nothing I can influence. I think we also can't do this with our members. We're just not allowed because of due to laws. And I say I would use what we have so far and make the best of it. And other layers on top of that, I don't think we will ever look into that.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
For privacy concerns.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to all of the speakers. 3 fantastic talks this time. A reminder that the nominations for the 2023 Applied Networking Research Prize are open. So if you know of any good work, any interesting people, any interesting papers, please do nominate. Nominations close at the end of next week. Thank you, everybody.